All right, I think it's about time we got started. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. It's really good to see some familiar faces, and even better to see a lot of new faces tonight. Now, before we get into the actual meeting, I just want to tell you a little bit about Fightback. We're a Canada-wide Marxist organization with sections all the way from Halifax to Vancouver. What we aim to do is to bring the ideas of socialism into the forefront of the unions, the campuses, and the streets. Now, the past years have given rise to some incredible mass movements, including, of course, the movement against climate change. And we believe that Marxism provides us with the very best tools in order for these movements to move forward. Now, that being said, we're not just a Canadian organization, we are an international organization. We are just the Canadian section of the international Marxist tendency. We have presence in over 45 countries spanning across all continents. That is excluding Antarctica, but I'm sure we'll break through there soon enough. Now, a few things to get into about the presentation before we actually get into it, just in case you've never attended a Fightback event before. We'll start out with about a 30-minute presentation from one of our members. Tonight, we're having Alvaro speak on climate change, a subject I know he's very passionate about, and then we'll open the floor up to discussion. After the discussion, I'll hand it back to Alvaro, who will then wrap things up to cover any comments, questions, or even criticisms that might pop up while we're speaking. Now, after the wrap up, we're actually going to split up into breakout rooms so we can continue the discussion in a bit more of a casual format. Now, we'd like to make this feel as close to an in-person event as possible. So I really encourage everyone to turn on your webcams. We're all friends here. We're all here to have a friendly discussion. I really promise you that no one's going to judge you or anything like that. I also ask if everyone can rename themselves to put their name and then include their city and whatever campus they're studying on or what their occupation is. It makes things feel a little bit more personable. We're not just kind of screaming into the void all evening, just kind of waiting for a response. We kind of have an idea of where everyone's turning in from. Now, with that being said, I'm going to pass the floor to Alvaro, and he's going to begin our presentation.
Hello, good to go? I'm going to assume yes. All right. So I'm going to begin with the assumption that since you are here listening to this discussion, that you understand climate change is a pressing issue for the working class today. This is especially true for Marxists. I'm not going to try to convince anyone that the climate crisis exists because I think every day we see the problems of the climate crisis banging at our door. Ultimately, the point of this presentation is to clearly lay out how capitalism is the root cause of the crisis and to present the socialist solution to it. Now, some of you may be surprised that Marxists would care about the environment. Often, Marxists are characterized as only caring about workers' revolution. When you put any problem in front of us, we pull out the handy one solution revolution card, and with that, we gain the moral high ground and win the argument. But this is not the case. And if the Marxists in your life are doing this, let us know because we're going to have to do an intervention for them. Jokes aside, while it is correct that we need a revolution, this doesn't sufficiently answer the questions that most workers, students, people in general are demanding answers for. Questions like, why does climate change exist when we have the scientific advances to reverse it? What happens to the workers who rely on non-renewable energy to feed their families and pay their rent? Can we just tax carbon and incentivize pollution? And my favorite, why don't you tell people to vote for the Green Party? To answer these questions and propose real solutions requires a material understanding of the crisis as a whole. So in a sentence, we can say that the current climate crisis is the result of capitalism. But concretely, what does that mean? We should start by describing capitalism. So capitalism means that there's a private ownership over technology and the means of production by the capitalists to make profit. Capitalists need to make a profit or they would go out of business and cease to be capitalists. So this competition forces the capitalists to fight whatever their individual intentions or moralities may be to keep their costs as low as possible. To do this, the capitalists lay off workers, drive down wages and benefits, and get rid of any regulation or standards that stand in the way of their profits. It is the anarchy of the market that decides, without a cohesive plan, what is produced, how it is produced, and how much of it is to be produced. Capitalists, by default, do not give one single rat's ass about the environment or the people who live in it, unless doing so increases their profits. Now, despite the countless individualist solutions that have been put forward by industry, governments, and activists alike, the reality is that under capitalism, the working class doesn't have the luxury of simply opting out of the environmental crisis. It's only 100 companies that are responsible for 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. And fundamentally, we can't change anything that we do not control. Regardless, it is worth looking at some of these solutions that have been put forward. So global leaders meet every few years to set emission targets and pat themselves on the back for solving the global economic crisis, or the global environmental crisis, pardon me. Then they go home and realize they can't meet their targets and push them back until they realize they can no longer put a positive spin on it and repeat the process all over again. The reason why they cannot meet their targets or solve any environmental problems is because they rely on market-based solutions. Market-based solutions are policies that use markets, price, and other economic manipulations to provide incentives for polluters to reduce or eliminate emissions. Things like cap and trade schemes and carbon taxes are examples of this. There are dozens of nations that have adopted carbon tax policies dating back to the early 90s, from Sweden and Finland to South Africa and Japan. While the specifics of each region's taxes vary, the outcomes have been shown to be very much the same. The working class pays, while corporations pumping the majority of emissions into the atmosphere weasel out of doing pretty much anything. All the while, the actual reduction in consumption and emissions is a drop in the bucket compared to what would actually slow down climate change. Trudeau's carbon tax, for example, allows an estimated 80% of industry emissions to go untaxed. In Alberta, the NDP also implemented a carbon tax. They implemented this tax after Alberta lost 100,000 jobs in 2014, after two economic crises, and after oil and gas companies cut corner after corner, allowing waste to leach into our waterways. The Alberta NDP came out with the tax and told us we all had to chip in and clean up the crisis. And I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say it was a slap in the face to working class people in Alberta. It reminded me of when my class went on a field trip to pick up garbage in the river valley, and my teacher told us that we should all do our part, so we should recycle more, turn off the tap when we brush our teeth, and take shorter showers. Okay. So the Alberta carbon tax was a really weird time. It's one of the few times I can actually remember where the oil barons in Alberta and the Conservatives disagreed on something. The Conservatives were adamantly against it, yet the oil barons were in favor of it. The CEO of Suncor even said, "We think a broad-based carbon price is the right answer." Now, what was this? We need to understand that for the working class, wages have remained stagnant, and in some cases have even fallen. In Canada since the 80s. For working class Albertans, this was another burden on their already overstretched wallets. But for the oil barons, the carbon tax was a small price to pay to be able to deflect the blame from them onto the working class. By opposing the carbon tax, the Conservatives could remain ideologically pure and portray themselves as defenders of the free market, fighting to keep more money in your pockets. Once the Conservatives came into power, they swiftly removed the tax. As for the Alberta NDP, trying to play ball with the oil companies, sending out Valentines saying, "We'll build a pipeline straight to your heart," and helping to put the blame for the environmental crisis on the Alberta working class, didn't really work for them. After one term, they were dumped. So another market-based solution that's often proposed by environmentalists has been subsidies to green companies and green capitalists. To be honest, this too has been a complete failure, but again, it's worth discussing. And really, Elon Musk is a really good example for this. So a tally taken all the way back in 2015 showed that the US government had given Tesla $5 billion in direct grants, tax breaks, cut rate loans, tax credits, and rebates. That's just in the US and doesn't even include indirect subsidies like electric vehicle-friendly infrastructure. It's worth asking, has Musk actually done anything tangible for the environment? Has Musk done anything tangible for his workers? He promised everyone an affordable electric vehicle that would save the planet, not an expensive piece of shit that's impossible to maintain, has a battery that is incredibly carbon intensive to produce, and is charged by electricity produced using fossil fuels. Elon and his supporters have tried to defend themselves, of course, by saying they're not the only ones receiving subsidies. And really, that's such a useless argument. It's like a thief trying to defend himself by saying, "I'm not the only thief here." They're all crooks, right? The green subsidies in all their forms, and always bankrolled by the working class, have yet to create any accessible option that actually has any impact on the environment. And carbon trading schemes are another example of a failed market-based solution. This was a favorite of the Kyoto Treaty, but has been proven to be essentially ineffective again. The basic idea is that companies could offset their emissions by paying for green projects elsewhere. In theory, this is great. It encourages less reliance on emission-producing fuels, while at the same time avoids the costs associated with moving away from those fossil fuels altogether. Carbon credits could be issued by projects that would reduce emissions or improve energy efficiency. The carbon credits could be traded on carbon exchanges, and polluters could buy the credits and count them as a reduction of their own pollution. Several travel agencies, for example, now offer customers a chance to offset the carbon emissions produced by air travel through paying for credits in schemes for energy efficiency. Yet the Financial Times says that it has found widespread instances of people and organizations buying useless credits that do not yield any reductions in carbon emissions. Their investigation has exposed this approach as a multi-billion-dollar scam, which will provide few real benefits. Of course, other than massive profits for some of the participants. In a series of articles published by the Financial Times, they described how a carbon gold rush has led to the setting up of a large number of carbon offset trading companies, which act as intermediaries between buyers and sellers of carbon credits. Many of the projects that have been set up will fail to deliver the promised reductions in carbon dioxide. The Financial Times quotes an insider in the market as saying, "I would expect that half of the credits would not come through in the end." In many cases, credits are being sold for projects that do not even exist. So these companies can buy phony carbon credits for green projects that don't exist from companies that may or not be sock puppets for those buying credits to pretend that they're reducing their carbon footprint. It's really basically a cartoonish green Ponzi scheme. And because of the implementation of market-based solutions, it allowed overconsumption to come into the public consciousness. The idea that we, as individuals, are living beyond our ecological means is something we hear pretty often on the left, especially from environmental activists. We're told we all just need to do our part, that if we make small changes, they'll accumulate and solve the environmental crisis. This is basically the idea of ethical consumption, and this is absolutely false. But again, I'm going to explain. So the roots of ethical consumption really began in the 90s. The use of sweatshop labor in the third world by companies like Nike, Apple, and Walmart, among others, were exposed and brought to light. Also around this time, human-caused climate change began to become a concern for people other than climate scientists. The result of this increased awareness led people, typically with higher incomes, to begin advocating for what is known as ethical consumption. The basic idea is that each of us, as individuals, can vote with our dollar, and due to the laws of supply and demand, capitalism will stop exploiting people and the environment. But capitalism has simply adapted to this new situation and created markets for sustainable, fair trade, organic, eco-friendly products. And that's exactly what capitalism does. And these markets are no different than non-eco-friendly, unsustainable, non-fair trade markets. And the results are still the same. The wealth of society continues to be concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. So it's now 2020. People have gone green, eaten vegan, and bought fair trade for years. Yet the atrocities of capitalism continue, and the environment is still dying. The working class produces enough food to feed 2 worlds, yet every year millions of children die of malnutrition. Compassionate capitalists who voted to end hunger donated a meager 1.08% of their profits to actually alleviating hunger and poverty. Over 3 billion people live in poverty, yet 5 people own as much wealth as 50% of the population. Ethical consumption, like other solutions within the bounds of capitalism, have shown to have a negligible impact on our emissions, precisely because of an imbalance of pollution. As I mentioned earlier, 100 companies produce 70% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So a 2012 study found the carbon footprints of someone who consumes ethically and someone who doesn't aren't significantly different. The same study also found that working class people cannot afford a sustainable lifestyle due to poverty, lack of accessibility, and long working hours. For example, I have a good friend who drove a car for months that ended up putting her in the emergency room with carbon monoxide poisoning because she couldn't afford a safe car, much less could she afford a Prius. And this may be a hard truth to swallow, but it wouldn't matter if every person went vegan, used paper straws, bought energy efficient washing machines. Individual solutions may make some consumers feel better about living under capitalism, but they fundamentally do not address the root cause of the destruction and exploitation of the planet, capitalism. For the working class, going green is ultimately more expensive and has next to no impact. The working class is shamed to spending more money. Environmentalists get to feel good for doing their part, and capitalists continue to make profits. The market continues to produce as cheaply and irresponsibly as possible, and greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise. Again, it always comes back to the same question: who is actually doing the majority of polluting? Under capitalism, it's not possible for everyone to make ethical choices due to the systemic and economic inequality. However, the desire of working people to fix the crisis, save the world for their children and grandchildren still exists. It's only now just been commodified. And the capitalists love this for a couple of reasons. The so-called ethical green products are more expensive, and despite the profits going to the exact same place. The value or appeal of ethical consumption also allows the blame of climate change to be placed on individual working class people and not on the capitalists where it belongs. The reality is people who buy unethically are not voting with a dollar for slavery, destruction of drinking water, or environmental catastrophe, any more than those who buy ethically are voting for clean air, crisp water, and careless deers bouncing through meadows of wildflowers. And if we think about this critically for a moment, if every dollar really is a vote, someone like myself who has tens and tens of dollars in my bank account does not have the same voting power as a millionaire, much less a billionaire, right? So as long as the majority of wealth remains concentrated in the hands of a minority exploiting class, producing for profit instead of human need, workers' rights and sustainability will suffer. The choice of individual consumers are unimportant within the context of capitalist production. The major flaw of ethical consumption is that it's based on the illusion that there exists a more ethical option under capitalism, that if we pay a couple of extra dollars a planet organic, that if we have a paper straw literally biodegrade in our mouths, that we can achieve a more compassionate capitalism where the most profitable is also the most moral. Ethical consumption suggests that production for profit is okay, as long as it comes from a gentle capitalism that is nice to its workers, that cares about the environment. The reality is that the only way capitalists can make a profit is by exploiting nature and the working class. There is no way around it. Ethical consumption will always be an oxymoron as long as capitalism exists. Ultimately, I would go so far as to argue that the idea of ethical consumption is reactionary even. Although it does nothing for the environment, it does divide the working class between those who are moral because they can afford to purchase ethically and those that are immoral because they cannot. So one proposal that gained a considerable amount of traction in recent years is the Green New Deal. The term has been floating around for a while now, and its definitions change depending on who you're speaking to. So I'll kind of focus mostly on the plan proposed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, spearheaded last year for the sake of simplicity, and because proposed U.S. legislation pulled the consciousness of many workers towards the issue of climate change. So the Green New Deal is a set of proposed policies that would achieve a complete overhaul of all sectors of the economy, including agricultural, transportation, manufacturing, energy production, construction, and housing, in addition to generating full employment for all, affordable housing, and healthcare for all. Additionally, it sets out to end historic economic discrimination based on gender and race. The Green New Deal really marked a shift in how people thought about climate change beyond the market-based or individual solutions presented in previous decades, and was an objective step forward. And as Marxists, we wholeheartedly agree with the pressing and urgent need for these demands to be met. However, the Green New Deal is not a solution to the climate crisis. If we look at the original New Deal in the 1930s, we can see that why this won't work. While not his original plan, Roosevelt was forced to offer concessions to the working class as militant labor movements demanded a solution to the ongoing economic crisis of that time. They demanded answers for why they were unemployed, hungry, and homeless. On threat of revolution, FDR pumped funding into various public work projects, financial reforms, and regulations. But the New Deal did not work to alleviate the economic the economic situation of the 1930s. It didn't prevent a renewed economic downturn in 37 and 38, when 250,000 families were evicted from their homes, and there were 2 million homeless people migrating around the country. The set of reforms didn't work because it simply wasn't enough. The Great Depression was a crisis of capitalism, a crisis of overproduction. Marx wrote about this crisis and how it is inherent to capitalism over 100 years ago, and wherein there's too much products for the working class, the consumers, to actually buy. It was not the New Deal, but the destruction of the means of production and the retooling efforts of World War II that actually laid down the foundations for the post-war boom and affixed to this economic crisis. And the reason the Green New Deal can't achieve the goals, particularly the economic ones it sets out to achieve, are the same reasons that the original New Deal failed. It's why we're facing another economic crisis, set to be worse, just barely a decade after the 2008 crisis. The Green New Deal ultimately has set itself the task of saving capitalism. And at the end of the day, as long as that is the goal, any solution will fail. Capitalism will always fall into crisis because crisis is hardwired into its DNA. And as long as capitalism exists, the environment will continue to be plundered and destroyed in the pursuit of capitalist profits. Reforms that seek to control industry and force capitalists to be more environmentally conscious are built on the idea that it's governments that control corporations. In reality, it's the other way around. As Marx points out in the Communist Manifesto, politicians are only the executive committee of the ruling class. It is the capitalists who are really in control, and they have a stranglehold on everything. Now, not only have we seen a failure of ethical consumption to do pretty much anything, we've also seen a complete failure of international leaders to do anything. They're constantly meeting at these global climate summits where they fly across the world emitting greenhouse gases, sitting in their air-conditioned rooms, waffling away, not really doing much of anything except for agreeing that they really need to agree, or else we'll be facing an unavoidable climate catastrophe. And you can see nothing really comes from this. And I believe that even people in the climate change movement can clearly see the impotence of these political leaders to address something that is an international problem. All these leaders are ultimately tied down by one of the fundamental limits of capitalism, the modern nation state. The fact that all these countries are trying to protect the profits of their own individual capitalists and are trying to export the crisis, not only the economic crisis, but the environmental one elsewhere. People sometimes point to a reduction in emissions in places like Britain since the 90s, but in reality, those emissions and production has been exported elsewhere. And that place then gets blamed for their emissions. The best example is China, right? What we really have is an international problem, but the barrier of the nation state does not allow for international solutions. The environmental crisis cannot address this problem on a national basis. And hopefully no one brings this up, but just in case, globalization has not solved our economic problems either, let alone our environmental ones. In 2008, when the last major economic crisis hit, what did the different political leaders do? They saved their own local capitalists, their own banks, auto companies. All these companies came running to the protection of their states and governments, asking for bailouts. And they still cut thousands of jobs, and greenhouse gases emissions continue to rise. Keynesian measures of green deals, taxation, and the promotion of green industry have failed. Capitalism is in crisis. What these measures do is transfer private debt to public debt. And let's be clear here, governments are already up to their necks in public debt, and there really isn't any money left over for them to spend on research on green technology, let alone to implement it. And they can't afford to create green new jobs that are desperately needed because all of the advanced capitalist countries are so indebted. Governments across the world are carrying out massive austerity, slashing funding to social necessities like healthcare, education, and social services. The issue isn't that governments don't have any money to spend. The issue is they don't have money of their own to spend. The only money governments have is through what they can raise in taxes. So it really does come down to a simple question: who pays for the crisis? And this is ultimately a class question. Will it be the capitalists or will it be the working class? And as far as the environmental crisis is concerned, who is going to pay for the things we need in order to avert the climate crisis? Now, I know I run through a lot of ideas that I think won't work. They just won't. But I hope I haven't painted too bleak of a picture. We're still a Marxist organization, and good Marxists don't only criticize, but we also offer solutions as well. So if you've read Marx, there's a quote in the contribution of the political economy that I think works well here. Mankind inevitably only sets itself such tasks as it is able to solve. In other words, we only really ever perceive of a problem in society when the material conditions in society have grown to the point where it can solve these crises. In our time, it's only when we start to see the problems of climate change that capitalism had already developed the means by which we could solve these very problems. And humanity does have technology and the wealth inside to address ecological problems. Earlier, I said governments don't have the money to solve the ecological crisis. This is true. However, there exists enough wealth in society to do so. The main problem is the wealth is concentrated in the hands of a tiny private few individuals. The wealth is already out there and could be used, but under capitalism, if it cannot be used to increase private wealth, it sits doing nothing in a bank account in some tax haven. Currently, we have $600 billion spent by fossil fuel companies worldwide, searching for new sources of oil, gas, coal, etc., and another $600 billion spent by governments subsidizing these industries. Not to mention the trillions spent on military weapons used to invade countries that have massive deserts where we could be putting up solar panels, but instead we drill into them to get the oil underneath. What is even more fundamental to capitalism is $1 trillion sitting idle in banks. This is money that is not being used, that isn't being invested. It isn't being put into any kind of productive use towards solving any worldwide issue. And this isn't some kooky Marxist conspiracy. If we remember a few years ago when the Panama Papers were released, these documents exposed the fact that there were billions and billions and billions of dollars being hoarded simply because these capitalists felt it was safer to keep it in banks than to invest it in anything. The money is there very clearly, but it's not used productively because of the inherent need of capitalism to produce a profit. The technology also exists, but again, it is not profitable to invest in. It is really not a scientific problem, but one of ownership, or more precisely, a private ownership. Private ownership of ideas themselves, intellectual property rights. This forces different companies to compete against each other to recreate the same technologies in a slightly different way. If we just look at this, is there really that big of a difference between a Samsung phone and an iPhone? And imagine what we could already have if the best engineers and scientists from both these companies work together to develop cell phone technologies instead of recreating what's already been invented. This private ownership of knowledge also prevents valuable information being shared between scientists. Only a few months ago, it was revealed that Russia had stolen COVID research from the Americans. And it was a scandal. But why is COVID research even being hoarded? Why aren't scientists worldwide sharing all this information with each other, helping each other out to develop a vaccine? Again, the answer is simple: profits. The American government wants to ensure that their companies are the first to develop a COVID vaccine so they can sell it to humanity and make money. Technology and science created by humanity should be a global resource, but instead is hoarded. Rather than coordinating investment in development of technology and intellectual efforts to address the ecological crisis, companies instead are pitted against one another in competition, with the only people benefiting being the lawyers in court cases when everyone sues each other for patent infringement. There is no one technology nor one single solution to the climate crisis, but many technologies that, if integrated together in a rational, planned way, could solve these things. Obviously, though, such integration involves some kind of plan and cannot be possible under private ownership, under capitalism. So we come back to the fact that we can solve these crises. It's not a matter of scarcity of technology or money. As Marx pointed out, the problem is who controls the resources and for what purpose. Take food, for example. The earth makes more than enough food for everyone, but we still have poverty among plenty. Oftentimes you'll see famines in countries that are net exporters of food. These famines, more precisely than being man-made, are capitalist-made. Capitalism doesn't recognize social needs. When it talks about demand, it's really talking about the ability to pay, not the demand for a hungry stomach to be fed. In that sense, the famines we see today are not natural disasters. They're entirely man-made. Yes, the unexpected climate events happen, but the effects that they have on society are not natural. The lasting impacts they have are completely dependent on the economic development of that place. How can you have a place like Bangladesh, where millions of people are at threat of flooding every single day, and a country like Holland, which is halfway underwater, but nobody seems to notice? The point is that it is a question of economic development. Countries like Bangladesh, through centuries of imperialism and capitalism, have been kept underdeveloped in order to squeeze these people of their wealth by the ruling class. While advanced capitalist countries are able to solve these problems as they arise. Once again, we arrive at the question of the climate crisis as not a question of money or technology, but a question of class and who owns and controls that wealth and technology. And in short, you can't plan what you don't control, and you can't control what you don't own. As a Marxist, it's clear that the fundamental question has to be of eliminating the massive barrier of private ownership, of taking the wealth and technology that exists and putting it under a common, rational, democratic plan of production. This is fundamentally is what we mean as Marxists when we say revolution, a complete transformation of society, not trying to appeal to the mythical morality of capitalists or modify the system so it becomes more benevolent. You cannot expect to have a rational debate with people who defend a completely irrational system. And we are confronted by the irrationality of capitalism every single day. It's a system where we have homelessness literally next to empty houses, mass unemployment alongside people who are forced to work 2, 3, 4 jobs, austerity against the working class on one hand, and on the other hand, we clearly see the rich getting richer. Capitalism isn't about morality. It isn't about rationality. It is about the profits of a tiny few. You cannot persuade these kinds of people with arguments or morality. You can't even persuade them with economic arguments. For the capitalists, it would be much cheaper to deal with this crisis now as opposed to dealing with it later. But capitalists still don't listen to these so-called rational arguments. We cannot persuade capitalists to save the planet because they already live on a completely different planet from the rest of us. They live somewhere else. They live somewhere where they can pay their way out of feeling the effects. And, I actually mean this literally. I mean, Elon Musk is still trying to go to Mars, right? So under capitalism, there is an irreconcilable contradiction between production and the appropriation of capital. On one hand, our production is socialized. Workers from different branches of industry work together and collaborate in their workplaces. On the other, the wealth that those workers produce is appropriated privately, and it is concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. This contradiction of capitalism is the fundamental driving force behind war, poverty, starvation, all the misery we experience today. Our planet is being destroyed from a reliance on non-renewable resources and corporate disregard for a crumbling world in pursuit of profit. While the ruling class tries to shoulder blame on workers and offer reusable glass jars and hybrid vehicles as a solution to climate change, they ravage the environment, crossing every inch of the globe, searching for resources, new markets, and cheaper workers. Environmental destruction is inherent to a system based on private ownership of the means of production and production for profit. The capitalist doesn't care about the world tomorrow, but only about how much money they can squeeze out of the earth today. Now, I've been beating around the bush a little bit here, but the only real solution is to get rid of capitalism. We need a fundamental transformation of society to a higher form, i.e. socialism. We need to break through the obstacles of private property in the nation state. And what we need is the organization of all layers of the working class, a united struggle against capitalism. The anarchy of capitalism can only be addressed by a rationally planned economy controlled by the workers, producing for the needs of humanity and not for the needs of profit. The seeds of the future social society are still contained within our present capitalist one. If we just look to a capitalist factory, we'll find that capitalists know all about planned production, that their production is not left up to the market economy. Take a car manufacturer, for example. They don't sit around waiting for free market to decide what parts will arrive, how many workers will be on shift, or where finished cars will be distributed. These things are highly planned because even capitalists know that planning production is a superior way of producing things and mitigating waste. Under socialism, this planning can be generalized, and the appropriation of wealth that is produced can be socialized. Marxists believe that the working class is entitled to all it creates, that our bosses shouldn't be leeching the profits that we produce. We do not want to be, nor do we have to be scavenging for crumbs. And you know what? We shouldn't have to be settled on getting a whole pie. We should get the whole damn pie factory. Capitalism relies on the exploitation of workers. It cannot function without depriving the classes that built the world as we know it, the working class, of all the wonders that exist. The environmental movement has been gaining strength in the past few years. And the capitalists have again tried to divide the movement by making the question seem to be, well, do you want jobs or do you want the environment, or do you want to save the environment? Do you want jobs or do you want to respect indigenous communities? As Marxists, we should be rejecting these questions because fundamentally there is no real conflict between all these forces. Marxists argue that there is a solution that ensure the creation of good jobs that will respect the environment and respect indigenous communities. The solution lies with the genuine nationalization of the commanding heights of the economy under workers' control. We need to have a rational plan for the development of society. And I'll go back to what I said before, that you can't plan what you do not control. You can't control what you do not own. For example, how could we even begin to build a sustainable supply of energy when the electricity industry, mines and water companies are privately owned, operating solely to make profit? How do we begin to respect indigenous communities when these same companies go and extract natural wealth of these lands despite being opposed to by indigenous people? Nationalized under a socialist plan of production, monopolies that were once the main source of uncontrolled emissions and destructions could employ modern green technologies to slash emissions and pollutions in the space of just a few years. By combining the best scientific minds with the skills of workers in industry under democratic workers' control, we can put all of society's technological abilities and resources at the service of humanity and the planet, instead of a profit of a minority. Left-wing political and social movements are on the rise around the world. The task now is to take the militancy and radicalism of the student climate strikes into these wider movements, with workers and youth fighting together for bold socialist environmental policies. In some countries, the climate strikers have correctly reached out to trade unions for support. This is the correct approach. The unions must now respond by supporting students with mobilization and strike actions. This is not just an issue for young people, but something that affects all workers. The power of the organized working class, armed with the socialist program, would be unstoppable. And as Marxists will constantly remind you, not a light bulb shines, not a wheel turns without the gentle permission of the working class. The technology and science exists to deal with climate change, but under capitalism, these forces are destroying planet Earth, not saving it. Exploitation, oppression, and environmental restrictions are inescapable under a system based on private ownership of the means of production. Capitalism will eventually destroy our planet and humanity along with it. So the choice placed on us is really simple. It's socialism or barbarism. And to be frank, to me, socialism sounds much better. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for that, Alvaro. Now, before we get into our discussion, I want to take a quick moment to completely 100% shamelessly plug our paper right here. Now, we publish this about monthly, and it's full of our own Marxist analysis on different current events. Right here, I have September's issue, which includes articles on the Canadian economy, the government's abysmal back-to-school plan, and the recent Black Lives Matter protests down in America. A basic subscription will run you only about $30, which really only exists to cover shipping and printing. And out of that, you get 10 copies for the year. So, I mean, $3 per edition, right? I mean, sounds like a steal to me. So if you've liked what you've heard and you want to hear more, you want to keep in touch with what we're saying about what's going on in the world at large, I really recommend that you go online and you get yourself a subscription. Now, getting into the discussion. The way that this will work is I'll have you guys raise your hand on Zoom, and then I'll throw you down on my speakers list. We'll unmute you, and you'll have an opportunity to make any kind of comment, question, or criticism that you want to share. It can be anything, just so long as you make sure to keep it respectful. Just for the sake of time and letting as many people as possible speak, I'm going to ask you to limit yourself to only about 3 minutes. If you start to go over, I'll let you know. And if you keep going over, I'll unfortunately have to cut you off. Now, I really don't particularly want to do that. So please just be mindful of your time. All right, so I will give you guys a quick opportunity to raise your hand in case you don't know how to do that. You go to the participants tab down there, and then you go to the right-hand side and there will be a button that says unmute. All right, first up we have Didier Chalin. I'm so sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. You may go ahead.
Am I unmuted? Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are. We can.
Yes. Okay. So basically, I guess I have two questions. First of all, there have been climate strikes, but first of all, at least in Montreal, I've noticed there were not necessarily many workers who were taking part into it. There were a lot of young people, but many university students and often students from, I suppose, higher income, etc. And so that's the first thing. In France, also, we have to remember that the yellow vests were happening pretty much at the same time, or they've never really stopped, actually, the yellow vests. But the workers were with the yellow vests, and the climate strikers were basically in totally different movements, and the two did not connect. And this, I've seen that time and time again in all sorts of French newspapers, that the workers and the climate strikers were not connecting in France. And so basically, not only was it not super representatives of workers, but at least as far as I'm concerned, the strikes, like there was a big march in Montreal, 200,000 people. And then 2 weeks later, nothing changed and nothing happened. And this is not because of COVID, because COVID happened in March. So it's almost as if the climate strike happened and then nothing happened after that. So I'm trying to see what's the Marxist perspective on what I would consider the failure of the climate strikes. But of course, like, was it a failure? Am I mistaken to believe that it was a failure? What's the Marxist interpretation of someone like Greta Thunberg and the kind of movement she wanted to start? The second question is that there's this new movement around food sovereignty. Basically, the idea that you need to eat local, and you need people to be able to have local food and to cultivate local food, as opposed to keep importing foods from elsewhere. And there's even farms that try to buy local, but as you said, those farms are far more expensive. And so there's a lot of groups who are looking at food sovereignty as a solution. So I'm trying to see how food sovereignty could happen in an international context created by a new Marxist revolution. And I think that's an important question because, as Marx explained so well in Das Kapital, this whole crisis started with the enclosure acts of the Industrial Revolution, because before the enclosure acts, the peasants basically owned everything in common, and they were cultivating everything in common until the land was privatized. And it's the separation of the peasants from the means of production that created the proletariat in the first place. So now the problem is that we have to reconcile the internationalization of the movement with the need for local action. And I'm just wondering, how do we do that? So these are my two questions.
Thank you very much for your comments. Like I said, just raise your hands up and I will get you down on my list. It's all good. I can wait all night. I can do some extra reading. All right. I saw James from Hamilton. You can go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? All good? Perfect. Well, I guess my thought is that there's a lot of thought put into a revolution, but leading up to said revolution, we could already start to share resources, including like local farming and stuff like that. That's just kind of a thought that popped into my head stemming from the previous gentleman's comments there.
All right. Thank you very much. Next up, I have Phoebe Wong. You can go ahead.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic. Thank you for the lead up. I think that it has a lot of relevance. Like I like your critique of like kind of how the ruling class kind of exploit the movement to hide their own hypocrisy, but also basically market new products. I also think that they use it as the excuse to actually oppress like marginalized people, like poor people, people of color more as well. For example, like in the Nunavut and Northwest Territories, there's many people who are making their living off of selling the steel first, and they would eat the steel themselves, many of them. But then when they had in the, maybe it was sometime 70s or something, then they start to say, oh yeah, this is very bad thing, focusing on another group in Newfoundland, which wasn't even part of the majority of seal hunters, and saying that they were the ones who are like, you know, not doing the environmental things. But actually this was like sustainable and is sustainable for them. The activists with the tiny little white seals that they are giving away for free because they have so much money, like not even maybe active, but the charities, I guess, like Greenpeace and whatever, they they were giving all this stuff away, and then just, but Inuit were, you know, they're eating that thing. They have to pay so much money for food. It's so expensive. Some of them, a lot of people cannot afford to eat unless they hunt food themselves. And then they were just saying these things. And then the other alternative in the Nunavut for them to make money is things like a seismic drilling, which is much worse for the environment. Yet nobody brought this up or presented them with any, you know, solutions to try to resolve, improve their already impoverished lifestyles. And by putting the ban in place, they became even more impoverished. So you can see, like, you really need to have class perspective about this. Same thing with blaming like China. Like actually per capita, people from a low income area use a much more less. They have less carbon footprint than the others. So yeah, it's different, but it's also the businesses, as you said. Like it's not really any like West versus East or whatever. It's just those businesses take up more, and that's what need to change. You're right.
Thank you very much for that, Phoebe. Just a quick heads up, if you put your hand up and I put your hand down, that means I got you on your list. You don't have to worry about me not having seen you. I very much have you written down. So next up, let's hear from Dana from Vancouver. You can go ahead now.
Hi, yeah. So this is what I do for a living. I'm an environmentalist. So a lot of this, of course, rings true for me. And I think that a lot of the critique that was talked about today is the reason for so much hopelessness and mental health crisis within the environmental movement is being aware of these things. And when we talk about the like cap and trade and different things that were talked about in this speech, those were originally like conservative policies to tackle climate change. And then what happened was you had the largest polluters in Canada, which are, you know, some of the most largest polluters in the world, who gave money to organizations like WWF, Greenpeace, Environmental Defense, pretty much all organizations that you've heard of, to say, no, this is where it's at. We're all about cap and trade. We're all about like these types of models because it, you know, of course, benefited them specifically. And that's why you have like it becoming a liberal policy and moving forward, just because it was, you know, what the wealthier percent want. And that's something that I think most environmentalists are aware of. But when you have an organization, whether you're a nonprofit or a charity, you rely on individual donors or you rely on grant money. And so that's always coming from the wealthy or it's coming from the upper middle class. So we are completely at their will, and we're aware of that. So we'll be making campaigns about straws or plastic that environmentalists don't give a shit about, because that is where the upper middle class want us to be. And that's where the even wealthier want us to be, because they want us to focus on these little battles instead of these larger issues, which is the fact that if we want to stop climate change, we can't have capitalism. So it's all very much intentional. And I think most environmentalists are quite aware of that, but we're sort of stuck in this is the only way we can keep our doors open and keep ourselves employed. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for that. By the way, no shade intended to you, but I really encourage anybody who does speak to turn on their cameras. Thank you very much, though. That was very insightful. So next up, we're going to hear from Yam. You can go ahead.
Thanks, Marcus, and thank you so much to Alberta for that.
Hey, sorry, don't mean to interrupt. You're very quiet. Could you turn your mic up? While we have you figuring that out, we are going to hear from Sam from Hamilton. I like the rhyme scheme there, so you can go ahead now.
Hi, everyone. Sam from Fight Back Hamilton here. I'd like to thank the organizers of this event for a really meaningful and topical lead-off and event that they're organizing. I have to say, for me, the impending environmental crisis is one of the things that has driven me to call myself a socialist and to get involved with Fight Back in Canada. I remember reading or seeing Al Gore's documentary about global warming in 2005, reading all about it and being very young and just being seized with this sense of dread, holy shit, things are getting really bad. This could be, the end for millions, if not billions of people, and for, human life as we know it. So, things seemed really bad, but then I looked around and I saw what the powers that be were proposing to do about it. And the answer seems to be basically nothing. There's different wings of the ruling class that have different policies towards climate change. The liberal wing of the ruling class says, cap and trade, don't use straws, etc., etc. And either it's completely meaningless, like not using plastic straws, and so it gets adopted, or it's a market-driven solution that does nothing, and so it does get adopted precisely because it won't do anything to damage capitalism, which is really the root factor of climate change. And I think that creates a lot of anxiety for a lot of people. I know it did for me when I was young, and it's easy to believe that the solution is, consumer boycotts or modifying consumer behaviors, ethical consumption, etc. And while I certainly don't want to, shame anyone for doing that, I just don't think it's a political choice in and of itself. It's entirely based on the decision of the individual consumer, and most consumers don't have very much to spend. With wealth being as concentrated as it is, and being so unequal, most people can't really make a difference. If they're earning anything near a working person's wage in North America. The solutions from some that say we have to just focus on buying local produce and all, only eat within 100-mile radius, or only buy fair trade items or something, are all well and good if you have the money to spend on that, but most people don't. Most people can't afford that. And, human society has never worked that way. On all recorded history, no one has been completely self-sufficient. That's a pipe dream. People have always traded. What has not always existed is capitalism, is the desire for profit. And that is really what's killing the environment and might kill us. Thank you.
I hope it doesn't kill us. Thank you very much for that, though. Next up now, we can have, you can go ahead now.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you, Marcus, and thank you, Alvaro, so much for that great lead off. I hope that what my intervention might actually talk a little bit to Didier's question about Greta Thunberg, especially. So Greta Thunberg a few days ago shared a article written by Scientific American titled "On November 3rd, Vote to End Attacks on Science." And her comment about this particular article, which I assume, though I'm not quite sure, I don't plan on reading this, I assume the conclusion is that the only way to stop these attacks is to vote for Biden, who apparently is standing for science. And she says, "I never engage in party politics, but the upcoming US elections is above and beyond all that. From a climate perspective, it's very far from enough, and many of you, of course, supported other candidates. But, I mean, damn. Just get organized and get everyone to vote #Biden." So for those few who might not be aware of Joe Biden, he is not exactly known for being a particularly progressive candidate. And the idea that he might do much anything for the environment, considering how his love of supporting capitalists and fracking, is a bit silly. But this is the sort of moralism we get from these reformists, these people who think that only by small changes that apparently can affect us sooner is the only way to get to the place we want to go. And this also speaks to Phoebe's point about the moralism, is that anyone who falls out of line with what the capitalist class has decided is the right approach, the moral approach to climate change, is considered somehow morally bad, that they are somehow morally bankrupt for following the same practices that they have followed for hundreds, even thousands of years without damaging the environment. And in her book or monograph, Reform or Revolution, the German Marxist Rosa Luxemburg has something to say about this idea of this absolute science, this absolute moralism. She was referring to a reformist at the time who was coming up with this idea that essentially says we need to do pretty much nothing, that we need to do essentially nothing, and finally capitalism will work everything else on its own. And she says that he succeeds in expressing, he thinks he succeeds in expressing human, general, abstract science, abstract liberalism, abstract morality. But since the society of reality is made up of classes which have diametrically opposed interests, aspirations, and conceptions, a general human science in social questions, and abstract liberalism and abstract morality are at present illusions, pure utopia. The science, the democracy, the morality, considered by reformists in general, including this Bernstein hundreds of years ago, as well as Thunberg today, and many others, including the Green Party in Canada, the science that they consider the dominant science, that they consider, absolute science, absolute morality, is merely the dominant science, dominant democracy, and dominant morality. That is bourgeois science, bourgeois democracy, bourgeois morality. So when people yell about, the only way to do this morally, the only way to really solve the climate crisis is to do it slowly, to cause the least damage, is to vote for people like Joe Biden and the Greens, they're really just they're just acting as mouthpieces for the bourgeoisie and nothing more. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Yam. So my speakers list is wide open, and while I wait for what I'm sure are the impending dozens and dozens and dozens of hands, I'm going to take a quick moment to ask you guys for more money. So if you head on to, if you like our ideas, and you want to read a little bit more than what's offered in just kind of a brief article in a magazine, I really recommend you go to our website and check out our bookstore, where we have just a whole array of different kind of Marxist literature, both classic and contemporary. For example, we have this here, Imperialism by Lenin, which is a Marxist classic, but we also do have kind of our own modern works that we've written ourselves. For example, this nifty little pamphlet that we actually have on this exact question. It's just called The Climate Crisis. It's very, very good, addresses this topic very, very well. And I recommend everybody go online today, pick up a copy or 4 or 5 and give it to your friends and family. So that being said, again, speakers list is wide open. And if you have any kind of questions or comments at all, we would really love to hear it. I got no other plans tonight. I can wait. Oh, sorry, James, I did not see you. Yeah, you can go ahead again. James from Hamilton. You got a couple Jameses.
Well, I guess it kind of leads back to what I was saying before. I suppose it would be apt to start taking action before any kind of like grand revolution takes place, because I suppose a lot of us have spare time that we could maybe donate to organizing ourselves towards a solution in the meantime. And I guess specifically what I think about a lot is if we could implement some of the systems that we'd like to ultimately be in place once the revolution does take place, like how we would distribute resources to one another and stuff like that. So I guess maybe that's something we could consider as a group, some things we could organize that way. That's it.
Thank you for that. Next up, we have Andy Wing from Minneapolis. So you can go ahead.
Thanks for the presentation. It was excellent. I just want to contribute a couple of things as far as the approach to the fight, I guess. And I think, some things that have been pointed out that have been great are the attacks on the working class for the blame for climate change and all the effects on the planet. I think there's others that, haven't really been addressed, but it's in that same realm. Like one I think of is, proponents for population control, things like that. There's a lot of folks that say, there's too many people on the planet, or they'd be fine with some people leaving the planet so that it's better off. But, interesting, those people never want them or their family to leave the planet. But, there's issues like that that are really at the heart of it. But like really, I think it was The Guardian, they had an article, but there's tons of data on it where it's like 100 companies were responsible for like 70% of carbon emissions or something like that. So I think, the focus is on who's causing this problem and how do we address them. And while I'm in full agreement that unfortunately it can't be addressed, fortunately or unfortunately, it can't be addressed without overthrowing capitalism. But, I think that there's a fight to be had to lead to that, because I think sometimes people can hear that and say, what's the point? I'll just wait by the wayside for revolution. And that's not really the Marxist approach. The Marxist approach is to find ways to struggle, advance the class interests. I even think there's issues with things like taxing the rich. That's one of the demands to fix stuff, but we still have to think about when you tax the rich, who's in control of that money, where do they put that money? Is it just more money for a capitalist government to fund wars or do whatever they want with it? The issue is that we got to hit the capitalists directly, even if it's before we take power as workers. We can hit them directly by, a sustained fight, which the speaker was pointing to, in this presentation, through the labor movement, through the union movement, through a climate change movement of the masses, putting pressure on the capitalists to give up their money directly. Because all types of regulation and stuff, we're basically putting it in, we're trusting the capitalist government to do our bidding, which they prove over and over that they won't do. So I just think these are important things to think about, but I wanted to pose a question also to fight back, I guess, in general, to expand more on what that transitional program looks like. How do you fight to advance and increase the fight against climate change before overthrowing capitalism? And how do you use that fight to actually gain foothold and strengthen the working class to actually be able to take power? So that's my question. I'll end there.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comments. Next up, we have Ken from Seattle. You can go on ahead.
Okay, I want to address actually that last speaker and also the earlier one on Joe Biden's science, because I think they're looking at the same thing. I actually have read that article in Scientific American. No one is suggesting that Joe Biden is going to single-handedly or in the least solve the science crisis. But what they are pointing out is that the difference between Biden and Trump is so significant that even though they're both capitalists and they're both in the sway or control of large corporations, there's enough of a difference that it does matter while we are waiting or fighting for the revolution. And so for those of you who are American voters, unless you are one of the people who are hoping for early destruction, bringing about a revolution, which I'm personally not that wild about, we have to live on this planet while you're waiting for the revolution. And the complete denial of science is very different from at least making some kind of progress or at least stopping the blatant destruction while we get there. That is all.
Hey, thank you very much. Real quick before we get back into discussion, Andy, you asked about the transitional program from the environment. I'm not going to answer that, but we had a viewer who did send in an article from the IMT literally titled Transitional Program for Climate Change. So I will just post that in the chat if anyone wants to take a look at that. Thank you very much for sending that over. All right. Again, speakers list is wide open. Okay, next up, I think we'll have Britt from Kelowna. So go ahead.
That happened so quickly, sorry, I was not prepared. Well, me and my sister were just having a discussion earlier about this. Like, how do you get more people to care in a world where they are focused on just surviving day to day? And you know how TikTok and social media and Instagram is always in our faces. And she has a marketing background. And like she says things like nonprofits, get free Facebook advertising up to $10,000. And like you see how viral TikTok videos go off. And she's really about data. And I'm just like, ooh, data, you know, it's all over the place. Who do you trust? But she's like, if someone just sees like how much carbon footprint paper straw save or bags or cattle versus mining, if they have like all of that in a graph and they see it as a meme or something. But I guess this is just a niche, small part of the bigger issue of getting people radicalized. I mean, they'll mostly get radicalized by the experiences they live through and the austerity measures they often see, because you know, this capitalist realism we're living under, people just think like, how can you ever fight the status quo? So that's it, I think. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Next up, we have Genevieve from Halifax. So going ahead.
Hi. First off, thanks so much, guys, for that awesome lead off. I just wanted to just like touch on how like important it is that we're talking about how there is no ethical consumption under capitalism, and when capitalism forces us to shame our peers and our fellow working class people for, you know, still eating meat or going to Forever 2021 because maybe that's all you can afford, and being like, oh, you should get like this all naturally sourced, like from like just down the road. Like if you can't afford that, that's like, you shouldn't be shamed for it. And that's a big thing I've noticed in the culture, like especially like here at university, or just like back when I was in high school. Like a lot of people, I went to like a arts high school, and it was quite like liberal more, right? And everyone would be like, oh, like you're not vegetarian, or you still go, you know, you still buy like fast fashion because like you can't afford, like if you can't afford anything else. And it's very shameful. Like they don't really consider the corporations that are actually exploiting everyone, and they're kind of just playing into their hands because it's dividing the working class rather than us all coming together to fight against the bourgeois. So yeah, sorry, that's all I have for right now. But yeah, thank you so much. Really awesome event.
Thank you very much for that. Glad you're enjoying it. Now, before we get into the next speakers, I want to take a very quick moment to plug our social media. Yeah, so we have a Facebook. It is just Fight Back. That is our national Facebook page. We have different kind of Facebook pages for different campuses and different cities. So just off the top of my head, you can check out Socialist Fight Back Edmonton, Socialist Fight Back Halifax, and we even recently started up our Facebook page for Socialist Fight Back Calgary. So I really recommend checking out all of those. We also have Twitter and Instagram. Both of those are at Canada Marxists. And I've been recently informed that we also have a TikTok now, which I believe is also at Canada Marxists. So I recommend you follow absolutely all of those. If there's any of those that you don't have, make an account so you can follow us. We could always use a few more clicks, right? We would appreciate it. So next up, we're going to have Jack B from Toronto. So you can go on ahead.
Hi, can you hear me? Cool. I kind of wanted to address this question of like, you know, what do we do now? And like, why aren't we doing or encouraging more sort of like small scale activism to fight climate change? I think like the issue here is that, and I think as Alvaro explained, like the task of addressing climate change is like, it's monumental, right? And it demands like that you need like the massive side to get behind you to actually address these problems. Like it's like a deep material problem with our society. Like we need to completely shift the way we do production, you know, electricity, infrastructure, all of this stuff. And to do that, we need to seize the means of production, seize the means to do that. Because I think, as we explained, like we have the ability, we have the wealth, we have the resources, but we have to. But right now they're under control of a class of people who have no interest in addressing climate change, and that's the fundamental problem here, right? You know, Fight Back is like 300 something people. I think most activist groups are not too much bigger than that, right? Like if a small group of activists could address climate change in any meaningful way, then it wouldn't be an issue, right? So yeah, like, and in terms of like linking it, like, I mean, what we can do now, like what we need is for, you know, the Labour parties like the NDP, or not necessarily NDP, but a real Labour party to put forward a program of socialist demands, which would inevitably come into demands for the environment, right? If we nationalize the top 500 corporations in Canada, you know, that would include energy companies, right? And it would also include a bunch of infrastructure companies, food production, all of this stuff, so that we could put forward, you know, we could put forward a plan to start addressing some of these issues. Like, so yeah, if we had a party that was putting forward these kind of things, then yeah, these are things we could work towards like very soon. But yeah, like small scale activism like really isn't going to do it. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Jack. So we are approaching the end of our presentation. So I just want to put out kind of a last call for speakers. So if you want to be on the list, I ask that you put yourself down right now. I'll give some time for people to figure this stuff out. Anybody else? All right. First up, we're going to have James from Edmonton. You can go ahead.
Thanks, Marcus. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the crisis of overproduction. This is kind of like a Marxist term, and I think it's really relevant for climate change because it kind of explains why capitalism is always making more than it needs to. So the crisis of overproduction is actually pretty simple. So all commodities under capitalism are made and sold for a profit. So if you kind of like look at my hands, and this is kind of like the price. And we can kind of split it up into two different parts here. So we have the part here that is responsible for reproducing the product. So that's like paying wages and paying for the materials that go into the product. And the other part here is profit. Now, if I take away profit, because this goes to the capitalists, we're left here with wages and materials. And if you notice, there's only one hand here. It's not the whole price. So the wages of the people that went to produce this commodity is less than the total price of the commodity. And what that means is that the people that worked to make this commodity can't buy that commodity back. So unless the capitalists are using and buying many more plates and beds and sheets and all of these common materials that people usually only have one of, then we're producing too much. People can't buy back these things that they're making. And when it comes to climate change, we're making way more stuff than we need to. We're making way more cups, beds, and all these other commodities. And I think this crisis of overproduction really is just kind of shows how capitalism is so just can't possibly deal with climate change. It's always going to want to produce more for profit. Thank you.
All right, thank you, James. Next up, we're going to hear from Peter. So go ahead.
Hi, I've just got a really quick comment. It was about a program that aired in the early aughts. There was a character on it who cared very deeply about the environment, and he ended up committing suicide because he didn't have a solution, any way to think of it outside of postmodernism. I find whenever I think about this topic, I get very upset. And it wasn't until I found a renewed interest in Marxism and began reading again some of the old texts that I'd studied earlier in life and walked down this path again that I was able to think more creatively about ways of society overcoming the problem again. And yeah, that's my comment.
I'm just fumbling around with my mute button. Thank you very much for that. Next up, we're going to hear from Will, all the way from Kentucky. So go ahead.
All right, thank you. I bet some of you are surprised that there's a communist in Kentucky, but yeah, here I am. I'm part of the IMT, which is the same international as Fight Back. We have a branch here with 6 members and growing fast. We only started just 2 years ago. And anyway, so enough about that. Let's see. Oh, I didn't know that you guys had a TikTok account. That is awesome. If someone could put the handle in the chat, that would be very appreciated. But anyway, on to the point. So there is a quote that's often thrown around by Alan Woods that goes, "The proof of the pudding is in the eating," and capitalism has been the world's dominant mode of production for centuries, but has the necessary action been taken on climate change yet? I think the answer is pretty obviously no. So before I continue, I know, like typical American, but I have to profess my ignorance of Canadian parliamentary politics. So I'm just going to use an example from the US because that's what I'm familiar with. So at least 97% of climate scientists agree that 1, climate change, it's real, it's happening, and 2, it is a direct consequence of human activity. Despite that, according to a study made in 2017, in both chambers of the US Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, climate change deniers make up about 53% of the total body of both chambers of Congress. And so we have to ask ourselves, what kind of democracy is this? And I think I couldn't phrase it any better way than Marx, Engels, and Lenin already have so long ago. And Engels's masterpiece that I love, called The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State, he has a quote in the conclusion chapter, which goes, "Freedom in capitalist society always remains about the same as it was in the ancient Greek republics, freedom for the slave owners." And Lenin, he based what you can maybe call his most famous work, State and Revolution, off of that book by Engels. And he rephrased the quote, or the argument, I should say, because he directly copied the quote in the book, and like cited Engels and all that shit. But anyway, Lenin said, in simpler terms, democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the rich. That is the democracy of capitalist society. And finally, from the Communist Manifesto, modern bourgeois society, meaning capitalism, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. So this kind of touches on James's intervention about the crisis of capitalism and or the crisis of overproduction, which is capitalism can produce a lot, but it cannot produce what it produces or how. The market just blindly follows the most profitable route. And this is precisely why capitalism is powerless to stop climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Well, I'm from Alberta, and the amount of times I've heard someone shocked that a Marxist exists in Alberta is no shortage of that. So I'm gonna be honest, I actually have a little bit more time than I was expecting us to be at right now. So I'm actually gonna open up the speakers list once again. So if anybody else, any spark came into it, any bit of inspiration, listening to those great comments, you can put your hand up and I'll throw you down. All right. In that case, we're going to start off with Calvin from Montreal. Go ahead.
Hey, how's it going? Wonderful presentation, wonderful discussion, everyone. That was really great to hear. You'll have to excuse me. I just got off my stationary bike, so I'm a bit disheveled. But I have to say that I got involved similarly than was discussed previously in Marxism through a fear of what was happening to the environment right now. It's terrifying. You see icebergs falling into the ocean, and you're terrified because you're like, I'm one person. I can't do anything to fix that. I can't, maybe I'll run over there and try to put the ice cube back up, but I can't because I'm one guy. And so I think that despair is very natural in a world where you're taught that you're not part of a class, where you're taught that you're not part of a group of people all in basically the same scenario as you, and that you're part of the working class. And I think to not take on climate change with a Marxist perspective is to be despaired. But Marxism in and of itself, I think I mentioned this in a previous intervention, is in fact a extremely optimistic viewpoint, and not optimistic because it's all going to work out and we all believe that we're going to do our best. It's optimistic because we study history and we know that the working class does all the work. It's an extremely powerful class. It includes the brightest minds, the strongest workers, the fastest producers of stuff all over the world. And so I think what's important is to tie that fight with, not just, we think of the working class, we think of, bearded angry men with pickaxes who hate, they just get cold all day. And we think of environmentalists as, only, full lotus floating hippies or whatever. But these are not, everyone has an interest in good working conditions and in good planet. And I think, there's this stereotype that they're separate, but they're really not. And I think that you see this in the way that a capitalist treats labor as a commodity. And, we're the natural world. I breathe, I eat, I'm organic in many ways. But labor power is a special commodity produced under capitalism that gives more value than you put into it. So you're paid less wages than you produce, like was excellently described before. And so that's the way the capitalists treat the environment. They take a thing that exists already that should belong to all humanity. They pay the least amount of investment into it and they extract everything from it. Not for need, not because it could be that we really do need a lot of oil, but they don't do that because of need. They do that for the profit motive. So they're taking more, and this crisis of overproduction that leads us to these economic recessions are the same. They both ruin our economy. They also ruin our ecology, and these are tied together. So what we need to do as environmentalists who are Marxists and Marxists who are environmentalists is to come together, and that is to join workers' movements and tie it not to just students, not just petty bourgeois activists, but to the working class as a whole. And I really do recommend. We recently did a really great article about the recent Green Party leadership race, where this man Dimitri Laskaris, there we go, almost won by a near margin, and he was calling himself an open eco-socialist. And so I think there's a really good article. I hope you guys could share that in the bottom. But it's, I think, a really good look because these are not separate issues. The working class and the environment. The working class is the part of the environment, and we need to tie those fights together, not by separating them. So, and that's kind of my ramble. Thank you guys so much. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much, Calvin. So next speaker is we have Andy from Vancouver. You can go ahead now.
Hey, thanks. I just want to make a few quick comments. Great discussion so far. That's the thing, I remember 10 years ago when I was, getting politically radicalized, of course, global warming was one of the big things, right? And so around then, I had been reading a lot of stuff by Bill McKibben, who's probably the most famous climate scientist in the States, James Hansen, who was a leading scientist with NASA. And you see that, they're able to, they're pretty scared about the future of humanity, right? About how the capitalists are simply turning a blind eye to the urgency of the question of global warming. But they have no solutions at all, right? Bill McKibben, for example, he was, he's American, but he was supporting Jeremy Corbyn's campaign in Britain where, Corbyn was fighting on program of socialism, but, he ended up actually capitulating to, the reformists in his party because he didn't have a concrete Marxist understanding of how can we actually overthrow capitalism and change society. Now, there's a lot of talk, amongst environmentalists about the global tipping points, right? And so, I'm sure a lot of people here might know a thing or two about dialectics, the Marxist method, where at a certain point, you have the buildup of quantity, and then you have these qualitative changes, right? And so, some say that, okay, well, if we don't take action in the next 10 years, significant action anyways, we're going to reach those tipping points. Well, from all the science I've read, actually, there's no way for us to reverse global warming. There's no way we're going to be able to avoid those tipping points. And in fact, things are going to get pretty bad in the next decades, right? Even if capitalism was overthrown in the next 10 years and we had a world socialist system, even next year, there's still going to be a lot of damage that's going to unravel itself, right? So there's no way we can reverse that. We're going to live in a very different world. But what we can do is have a society where a global socialist planned economy, really, right? That's all that can actually solve this problem. And by having that, we can put together all the best minds, put in a lot of resources into the science and technology, and actually deal with this problem scientifically. What do we need to do? And then let's do it, And so just to kind of give some optimism for a lot of people who might be a bit pessimistic looking at global warming, I really like this quote by Trotsky, so I'm just going to end with that. And so he said that he was, one famous Marxist revolutionaries, and he said that to understand the causal sequence of events and to find somewhere in the sequence one's own place, that is the first duty of a revolutionary. And at the same time, it is the greatest personal satisfaction possible for a person who does not limit their tasks to the present day. So, talk to fight back, see what you think for ideas, and hopefully you can have a bit of a calm, in regards to what's going on today.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Andy. So next up, we have Antoine, also from Vancouver. West Coast is going hot tonight, so you can go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to keep my video on to start, but I think it will likely freeze if it's not already freezing. Yeah, let me know if it freezes, and I'll probably turn off the video partway through. You got very bad connection. But I wanted to come in a bit on what Didier brought up about the climate strikes and were they successful. And yeah, I'm in Vancouver now, but I think I'm freezing, aren't I? Okay, I'm just going to turn my video off just in case. But sorry, is it freezing?
No, you're good now.
Good now. Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to keep the video off just in case it gets worse again. Yeah, like the question of the climate strikes, like I'm in Vancouver now, but I was actually in Montreal at the time of the Montreal climate strike, and that was the biggest one in the world at the time. And like the question, like, were they successful or not? I mean, they were successful in the sense that they sent a massive statement to people who like that extremely tired of inaction on this ignition, that we're reaching a breaking point with this. And it also brought in huge new layers of people into this active struggle, and especially the youth, as was mentioned. And another success, I think, of it was a much greater receptivity to revolutionary Marxist ideas than into past climate movement events that I'd been to. So I think those are good things. But like, were they really a success given the actual aims? and I would say that they weren't a solution, obviously, looking back what has happened since then. But this really shows a problem with the perspectives of the leaders of that movement and the environmental movement in general, which the perspective generally put forward is simply to put pressure on global leaders or to put pressure on bourgeois politicians. And that was evident in Montreal, where Justin Trudeau actually participated very laughably in the climate strike himself. So this is a hopeless path. All these politicians are puppets of corporations, which due to market mechanisms are actually incapable of doing anything notable as far as a solution. On the question of like the working class character of this that you brought up as well. I mean, often we can point to a lot of the environmental movement of not having much connection to the workers, to working class people. But I wouldn't say that about what happened in this last round, because there was 500,000 people, those are their initial estimates anyways, in the Montreal March, which is the biggest demonstration in Quebec history, actually. And that's 500,000 people at one march out of a population of a province of 8.5 million people. So it's impossible that there weren't a lot of workers there. There are also definitely lots of youth and even like high school students and stuff there and university students, but there are a lot of workers there. But what wasn't there was organized labor. There weren't unions there, unfortunately. And again, this, I think, comes down to a problem of leadership of the environmental movement itself, which has actually consciously not turned to workers as in order to spread this movement. It's often actually considered by some sectors that workers are somehow in opposition to the environmental movement. And in this sense, common outlook has been to individualize the blame onto like individual natural resource workers or whatever, right, as being the cause of destruction. But I think this is a massive error. And really if we want to actually move forward, if the climate strike movement wants to move forward, it has to be less based on student strikes purely. I mean, student strikes are great, but there needs to be a turn towards organized labor. And like the reason for this isn't like, it's not a moral reason. It's a tactical question. It's like the turn to the workers would be based on that objective role that they actually play in production today, that they can actually shut down the whole economy if they make that decision to. And the fact, of course, that they're the vast majority of people. But to actually get the majority of the workers clearly on side in an organized fashion, you'd have to explain to them how the broader capitalist system is the problem, and the problem is not a result of them as individuals. And then, of course, you'd have to explain, because actually there is a common enough approach or understanding in the environmental movement that capitalism is a problem, but that's often just presented as kind of like a mindset. Capitalism isn't a well worked out understanding of like a whole economic structure and everything. It's really just viewed as a mindset of greed or lack of concern for the environment. But that just basically inverts the question. That mindset is actually a result of market relations. Bring Marxist ideas to the environmental movement, we have to explain to workers not only how we can, but we also have to show how unfortunately, you have the contrary to that often, where you have a lot of environmentalists who actually kind of take pleasure in telling workers how their living standards should deteriorate and how they actually deserve deteriorating living standards because they are the individual reason for the problem, for the destruction of life on the planet.
Hey, sorry, Antoine. Don't mean to interrupt. Could you wrap it up soon? Thank you.
So this is unfortunately means that it's because they have a moral approach rather than a tactical approach to all this, and a general lack of theoretical understanding of exactly where the issue comes from. So I just think like some things that ways you can link this to workers and show how we can fight to protect the environment while also actually improving people's living standards are things like, say, under capitalism, houses are made cheaply without energy efficiency in mind, whereas under socialism, you'd be able to have everybody would be housed and be secure in their housing. Right now, we have actually a massive threat looming of of banks just getting ready once as this crisis unfolds to take people's houses as debt is just building up. And you'd be able to build those houses from the start in a manner that is actually energy efficient, that takes into consideration environmental standards. Under capitalism, you have public transit, which is kept to a minimum necessary just for people to find a way to work. But under a socialist planned economy, all resources would be put towards extensive public transit that would actually improve the vast majority of people's mobility while massively cutting down on emissions from cars. Under capitalism, green energy is a costly risk for individual companies, which can often mean bankruptcy in the short term if you actually seriously invest, retool your company. But under socialist, treated with the urgency of of the threat that is posed to humanity as a whole. You also have capitalism. Under capitalism, you have militaries that are patrolling the world as some of the biggest polluters. Like the American military pollutes about the size of the nation of Peru, I think it is now. But under a socialist economy, you'd be able to do away with national barriers and wars as well. I'll just wrap it up there. There are a bunch of other ways that you can link better living conditions to your regular workers, as well as cutting down on pollution. But I don't have more time to go into more.
Thank you very much for that, Antoine. So actually, last up, we're going to have Lane, Edmondson, and then I will hand that back to Alvaro, and he can wrap it up. So go ahead, Lane, Edmondson.
Thank you, Marcus, Katriniak. I just want to come in a little bit about some of this question about the differences between Trump and Biden, and specifically in relation to the environment.
Hey, sorry, don't mean to interrupt you. Could you back up from your mic just a few inches, maybe?
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Is this better? Okay. Yeah. In relation to the environment, between the difference between differences between Biden and Trump, because I don't think they are really very significant enough, especially to consider socialists lending any kind of support to Joe Biden. Biden's been incredibly resilient on actually maintaining fracking, on not banning fracking. And if you look at his record, really, in terms of oil production in the United States, it is quite interesting. While he was vice president, the Obama administration presided over a 45% increase in subsidies to fossil fuel companies. By the numbers, that's worse than Trump. I don't know about if you take into account the COVID stimulus, but that kind of went to everybody. They specifically targeted fossil fuel companies so that they would increase production. And that was definitely not for environmental reasons, right? Just this August, they wavered as well about actually banning those subsidies, most of which are in place because of his administration, many of which are in place because of his administration. They said at first that they were going to remove them, and then slowly they walked that back. And then people got mad, and now they've come back to it again. I imagine when they're not campaigning for votes, they'll tell you exactly how they really feel. And then, if you get a little bit deeper into the record, you can see that there was a policy pursued by the Obama administration of which Joe Biden was 100% behind, which he never criticized publicly, of actually, basically strategically increasing the amount of oil production in the United States and increasing exports from Alberta and decreasing their relative imports from Saudi Arabia and from especially Venezuela, which if you look at the difference in oil production between specifically Venezuela and Alberta, it's quite stark, right? Here in Alberta, you have, these oil companies that actually leave a lot of deposits in the waste and tailings ponds to leak into the river system, which end up in the Arctic Ocean, actually bringing oil sands tailings all across the environment, causing awful environmental destruction, as well as the fact is that here it's an energy negative process, meaning that you burn more energy, in terms of joules or in horsepower, any power unit, you burn more to get the more energy than you get actually out of the process by bringing up a barrel of crude oil is only possible because of low prices of natural gas and high prices of crude oil. that it really maintained like a really high profitability. In Venezuela, that's not the case, but they pursued these things for political reasons. And the reasons why they do that is because they are a ruling class party. The Democrats are a ruling class party, and they will serve the ruling class. That's what they exist for. Of course, the Republicans are a ruling class party as well, but the Democrats are essentially trying to do this with a nicer face, right? Maybe with a smile and a suit, be a little bit more polite, not so crass, things like that. So you have, well, Trump will flat out deny climate science. Biden will, say that, it's real. He'll acknowledge that it's true, but he won't actually do anything about it. In fact, he'll make things worse in the meantime. It's just kind of like when that article came out about during the Black Lives Matter movements, there was police, going rampant, shooting people with rubber bullets and all of these things. And Biden suggested that, the police just shoot people in the leg. So with Trump, you get shot in the head or the chest, but with Biden, you get shot in the leg. And so I think considering actually the strength and the numbers of people who want to fight for a better society, who want to actually, save the environment, who want to fight even for socialism, we don't really need to waste time in this debate, right? We don't need to actually, pick between Biden or Trump. And actually, it is counterproductive when we really should be focusing on our efforts in fighting for a Labor Party in the United States. Actually, a party that is willing to fight for a better society, one that doesn't, want to actually shoot people either in the leg or in the chest.
And thank you for that, Lane. I really don't want to get shot at all. So now I'm going to hand it back to Alvaro, and he can wrap it up. Take it away, buddy.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for the good discussion. A lot of the points actually were addressed. Kind of the questions that came up were addressed. So I'll keep this short. Just a couple of things I wanted to say. Didier, Antoine kind of answered your first question just about the climate strikes. I do kind of want to add a point, though. Greta really, I think she really doesn't matter ultimately. I think what's inspiring is the fact that we saw thousands and thousands and thousands of people, youth, starting to participate in the movement, right? And ultimately, as the struggle heats up, I do think the movement's just going to go way past her, right? They're just going to leave her behind. But that is a good thing, right? On your second question, this kind of idea of food sovereignty, eating local, so I don't want to be, not to be a racial stereotype. I really like avocados. Living in Alberta, they're hard to come by. I can't eat locally grown avocados. It's rough. Communities up north, really, they can't grow much vegetables, much fruits. So what are they supposed to do, right? And the fact of the matter is, we do produce enough of everything for everybody. The problem really is just how we distribute it. And it's done for profit from where it stands right now, right? Under a socially planned economy, we can actually plan these things to, make these things much more efficient, right? Instead of, 5 different trucks, one to go to Sobeys, one to go to Save On Foods, one to go to Superstore, whatever, every single grocery store. You could just have one truck going to all the stores, right? Already you're cutting down on emissions that way. And secondly, just to go to these kind of, organic food growers, or just these kind of, what are they called? What are they called, those markets? Just go to your local kind of farmer's market. Thank you. There you go. Yeah, farmer's market. It's a lot more expensive, right? I'm not going to condemn some guy who just worked 10 hours a day, doesn't want to go home and cook a meal just because he stops by McDonald's to eat a burger instead of, going to the farmer's market to pick up corn or whatever and have to grow it here, right? So it is kind of, again, it really comes down to kind of trying to manage capitalism, this eating local. It's just another way to kind of manage capitalism. And really, again, the idea of just managing capitalism really is kind of a lost cause. James from Hamilton kind of brought up this point about kind of how do we prepare workers to take control? How do we start getting them to get, know how to do these things? The fact of the matter is they already know. Truck drivers know how to drive their trucks. People working in warehouses know what they're doing in the warehouses. There really isn't anything we need to teach them. It's just a matter of, getting rid of the bosses who don't do anything at work except, sign a check maybe every 2 weeks, right? Get rid of that guy. Really, these workers can plan, can do these things on their own. There really isn't any kind of novelty for them, right? It's just a matter of who's benefiting from this production, right? It's not a matter of how it's produced. So, we can change it so that it benefits the whole society and those workers, as opposed to just benefiting those capitalists. So Andy Winger, how do we kind of prepare? It's a really good question on these transitional kind of program. Ultimately, I think Anton kind of touched on it a little bit, but really it is to link it up with a broader movement. I think we can get lost kind of just worrying about environmental issues. It does sometimes seem bleak, we get scientists telling us we only have 10 years, we only have 5 years, all this crap. But there's no shortcuts to revolution. Ultimately, it is overthrowing capitalism that will kind of at least open up the ability to address the climate crisis. So it is to link up the environmental struggle with not just the labor movement, but all kinds of movements, right? I mean, the U.S., we've seen a massive wave of people fighting for racial equality, right? The Black Lives Matter movement. It's to link up with that movement as well. Really, all these struggles really are interconnected, are linked. At the end of the day, they're all fundamentally caused by capitalism, right? By linking up together, we're much stronger and we're much more able to kind of finally just be done with this decrepit system once and for all. So, that's that. Everything else was kind of already covered. I didn't have much to say other than, if you're interested in what you heard today, don't be scared to reach out. You look up Fight Back on Marxist Thoughts, the Marxist.ca if you're Canadian. There's a lot of Americans here. Socialistrevolution.org or .com? Is it .org? I think it's .org. You can look it up. Get in touch. We're always trying to grow. We're always trying to put these Marxist ideas back into the movement, train people up in these Marxist ideas. That's all I really want to say.
Thank you very much for that. And just to clear up the debate, it is .org after all. Now, we are done with our presentation, but obviously the conversation isn't over. We got all our social media. We have our breakout rooms coming up, and we have our subscriptions. We also want you to get involved. So contact our Facebook pages, contact one of us, or contact the Join Now button on our website. We'd really appreciate hearing from you guys. So now, we are going to get split up into our breakout rooms. So I hope all of you enjoy another prolonged awkward silence while I get this sorted out.